coordinating our hybrid, you'll see me do a little bit of Oprah when she had her Oprah show. We'll come up and do that. So I'd first like to welcome, and thank you so much for that, Courtney, and the points that you raised, which are critical because despite whatever safe havens there may become in places like Massachusetts or California and New York, the reality in states like Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, need I go on, that we have people suffering, right? I appreciate you recognizing that and mentioning that. Our first panel is on health, law, and policing. And I'd like to ask our moderator and our panelists to come up. Kevin Jenkins from the University of Pennsylvania. Kevin, please come on up. Kelly Dineen, Thalia, González, Elizabeth Pendo, and Rafik, Nader, Wahbi. And I know that some of our panelists throughout the day, they're co-authors for papers, and so we might see one of the authors in both. But please come up, and then I'm going to turn it over to the moderator to lead the discussion for this panel. How are you? I'm doing fine, thank you. If you've got a mic up here, and will there be just the one? We've got multiple. Okay, great.
All right, well, good afternoon, everybody. Oh, absolutely not. We hadn't been out the house in a long time. Good afternoon, everybody. Hey. You know, there are times when we think about full circle moments. My name is Amhaad Jenkins. I serve as a lecturer and visiting scholar at the University of Pennsylvania. I remember roughly about 9 years ago, I was in my PhD program at the University of Florida, and I went to my mentor and faculty advisor, and I said, I believe in health services research. I said, I believe that the reason we're here is because of an intersection of racism, law, and health. This was in like 2013-ish. And I remember reading an article that began this journey that I'm on today that was entitled, Is Race-Based Medicine Good for Us? By this powerhouse scholar by the name of Dorothy Roberts. And somebody told us in those random professional development workshops that we go to as PhDs and all that stuff, they tell you like, reach out. So this country boy reached out. Now, if y'all know Dorothy, it took a long time for her to hit me back, right? Because it was literally months after I had reached out to her. I happened to be in the first time of my life in New York City. At 11 p.m. at night on a Sunday, Dorothy responds and says, oh my gosh, thank you so much for your note. If you're available to meet on Tuesday, I'm free. And you know, we don't say no. So I was just like, you know what? I'm available. Missed my flight the whole night, had to borrow money to get back home, long story. So it was in that moment we had this conversation about the role that racism plays. But it was also in that moment that she was talking to someone who was asked to leave his program because at that time they said racism was not a health services research issue. When I got to UPenn, I worked my butt off to get here without help, using the word racism. And now that we're able to at least say racism, how do we study it? Now that we're able to really approach and have a conversation just like this, the same one we've been trying to have, I'm gonna start it off the way I've done for literally the last 10 years, and that's, does race matter? When you look at the statistics, we always think that it's about race. You look at the disparities, the issues from education to criminal justice, to wealth, to where we live, to where we work, where we play, how we love. All of these various intersections all point us back to disparity. When you add the element of race into it, trying to answer the question, does race matter? Many of us, with our stigmatized view of the word race, we often say yes. But with the career that I chose to say it's not about whether race matters, It's really about, does racism matter? Today, we're here to really discuss how racism impacts, particularly the way we shape health law. Diving into those intersections from education, from the ideas and spaces of criminal justice, but also looking at mental health, looking at the idea of disability and race, looking at the fact that for whatever reason, there's been a gentrification even of drug addiction. There's been a gentrification even of empathy to these very issues. So today we welcome, I'm sorry to grab my program so I can introduce everyone and get started. So today we welcome the powerhouses to help us to start this conversation in a way that allows us to not just talk about, if you will, the history of the issue. Yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about the hysteria of the issue too, because there's a lot of that going on as well. But I think lastly, we have to talk about the hope of the issue. What's next? What do we look for? So today we welcome on our panel, Professor Thalia González. She's a senior scholar at Georgetown Law. And today she's going to talk about her paper that had a specific focus on education. We're also going to dive a little bit deeper as well with Kelly Dineen, as well as in other spaces. I'm sorry, I'm trying to find the actual note because everything went out of order. You know how this happens, right? You get up in front of people and it goes bad. So my phone's dead, so that's why we're here. So I want to introduce first from Creighton University School of Law, Kelly K. Dineen. Kelly, just wave. We also have, again, Thalia González. We have Rafik Nader Wahbi from UCLA and Elizabeth Pendo from SLU, St. Louis University School of Law. It's time to get to the discussion. We want to make sure that we have a fruitful one and one that doesn't just simply get stuck on what's wrong, but one that can get us to what we can do right to get us out of this space. So let's get started. So I would like to begin with the, y'all see I missed the orientation part. I didn't know. I wasn't gonna make a Chris Rock and Will Smith joke right there, but that could have been one. She scared me a little bit. So nonetheless, we want to begin the conversation today really setting up the history of the problem and really talking about the role I think that stigma has played as we've really tried to understand both issues of health law and its intersection with race and racism. So I begin with this very simple point. And I actually want to start with Kelly and Elizabeth, because in your paper and all the papers, we want you all to read them. We're going to try to point to specific pieces of the paper, but keep the conversation as high level as possible so we can be effective with each other's time. But you said in your paper that in the US, drug policy is a centuries long white supremacy project. Wow. Explain that. How does this kind of stack when we think about history, we think about where we are and kind of why we are? How do we kind of explain that in this space?
Yeah, I'll take that question if that's okay with you. So if you look back at the history of any legislation or policy around drug use or people who use drugs, right? Whether that legislation was aimed at policing and surveilling people who use drugs, or whether that legislation was aimed or directed at the importation of drugs, the markets, or the healthcare providers who were engaged in treating people who had substance use disorder or related conditions such as chronic pain. Those laws historically have all been aimed at racialized populations. So if you look, just for a few quick examples, the Marijuana Tax Act was completely aimed at Mexico and the trade in marijuana over the border. But and that, was in the 1930s. In the early 1900s, you have the Harrison Narcotics Act. Before that, you have a variety of laws aimed at the Chinese use of and trade in opium dens, right? So those are just a few examples. And of course, the Controlled Substances Act, which had both an implicit and explicit white supremacist goal, right? To marginalize and alienate populations that were perceived by the Nixon administration, including Black people or people, hippies, right? Countercultural, quote unquote, groups. So yeah, I mean, it just is. And so that continues to trickle down today in both the criminal legal system, but also the way we treat people who use drugs in healthcare.
And even with that trickle, Thalia, I think education has been the scary place to think about that, right? But it honestly has been the one where it shows up the most and how we kind of criminalize the criminal or the educational space. Can you just kind of talk just briefly about just really that history that I think a lot of us now look up and see a cop unfortunately throwing a Black girl across the room in a desk and they're like, oh my gosh, this is crazy, but this didn't just start.
Well, unfortunately, the crazy nature of it is that it's been going on since the inception of our US educational system, right? So to the extent when we think about the foundation of the US educational system, whether that be in law, policy, or quite frankly, the norms that were pervasive and even in the absence of law and policy controlled what schools look like, they were about social control, right? They were about ensuring that a certain set of bodies were not allowed to step into classrooms. And if they did, they were punished, they were excluded, right? And they were policed. And so to the extent, you can trace from the earliest beginnings of when we started to form both our formal system of education and our informal system of education, and then what the movements looked like throughout time. And so, for example, we point to the 1960s and desegregation as this wonderful space of a win, right? Like, wow, we're moving forward in a civil rights era where education will now become accessible. It was simultaneously when we now started to see the passage not only of laws that empowered police to set their feet onto school campuses and start to serve really significant roles with unfettered discretion, but it was also when teachers were then empowered to mark students as pre-delinquent. So when you think about the history of even the school to prison pipeline, it was a direct white response to desegregation. So the history tracks along with what we all know, right? Relative to structural discrimination, systemic discrimination, and that true ability to be limiting the possibilities of well-being and thriving of both Black people, but also Indigenous people, right? And people of color more broadly. So, this country was founded not just on anti-Blackness, but a settler colonialism framework. So the ways in which those interplay with each other and then continue to invisibilize, right? As Michelle was pointing out so aptly, is what then when we look today at the most recent civil rights data collection data that the US Department of Education puts out, which actually shows that for Black female students across every category of discipline, policing, suspensions, expulsions, both in school and out of school, they have the highest rates of disproportionality compared to any of their peers, not just white female peers, but all white youth. Right. And part of that is because we have invisibilized them because they sit at that intersection and focused on Black boys for long periods of time and just simply allowed race to eclipse.
And as we are in this space, it wasn't also just that it happened, if you will, and I don't mean us isn't just specific to race, but those who are from those vulnerable social identities. It didn't just happen to us. There was a fight back. And Rafik, I think, in talking about the history of social movements and organization, and there's always this assumption that apparently like people of color and those who are vulnerable are just waiting on somebody to come help them. There's also a history of how these groups have helped themselves despite the isms. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, whoa, I'm loud. Yeah, so one thing in my paper that we tried to do was to kind of move beyond the deficit framework of acknowledging a systemic issue like racism, right? We acknowledge that, in this paper we focused on involuntary commitment, And, we didn't spend too much time talking about the harms of it because it's been documented for about 8 years nonstop. It's been published over and over. So we didn't spend too much time doing that. But one of the things we wanted to point to is that this is a law that has been violently practiced for years, but it has also been resisted for years. And this is the case with any of the issues we deal with. And it's kind of like a frustration eventually, right? Especially those who are impacted. If those of us who are scholars who are writing and studying this, if all we do is keep talking about here's how people are suffering and not how the suffering are then fighting back, we paint a different picture. We paint a picture that is hopeless. We paint a picture of deficiency where people of color, Black people, Indigenous people don't understand the problems and they need someone like me to explain it. So, part of it is kind of recognizing, even in the process of researching, writing, understanding these things, is to also allow it to transform us. So part of the ways that this should transform us is to understand that we're not stumbling onto this thing and going out to tell people who have been involuntary committed, here's why it's bad. I actually wrote this paper to explain to everyone else why it's bad. So part of this, and at the end of the paper, I kind of focus a little bit both on some work that's happening in North Carolina and in Los Angeles. I'm more familiar with the stuff in Los Angeles. But in Los Angeles, the project that is being undertaken is one of organizing and education. So it's people coming together to say, this is the way it's been done. We don't want to do that anymore because that's harmful and bound and it's not reformable. So here's the way we're going to do it instead. And in cities across the country, I promise you, in every single one of our cities, this is happening. Specifically under an abolitionist framework. So while the word abolition might be new for some of us, it's honestly fairly new for me in the past 5 or so years. This is a very long tradition that has been practiced since the inception of this country, and it has continued today towards what we have as prison industrial complex abolition. But I'm joining in to something that's been going on in Los Angeles for many years, but more recently about 20 years. So I think part of this is kind of recognizing it's not just about documenting and writing disparities and how bad these laws are. I mean, it's bad, but it's also trying to understand how is change happening? How is social change actually coming about? The founders of critical race theory, that's really what they came together for. They said it's not just about talking about the terrible system; it's about actually changing it or undoing it. So. I think that's one area to kind of focus on in terms of hope is the struggle that's kind of ongoing in addressing these issues.
Thanks for that. I think that often we are trying to understand the balance, and this is for anyone who wants to answer. And I can just start from my side and go all the way down. But really about balancing the history and how we tell what happened and what's possible, right? Like trying to figure out what that balance is and how much of our work should actually focus on that. I think a lot of times in like medical research, when you're writing a paper, you got 2 paragraphs to kind of get it out, you can do it a little bit in the discussion, but outside of that, we're on to the next thing. So how do you kind of balance between, telling the how we got here and then telling how we can get out of it as well? So I'll start close to me and we'll move all the way down.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think when I think about adding in a disability justice perspective to the anti-racism approach, if it's brought in an ahistorical way, or if we focus too much on looking back, we risk actually compounding the disadvantage that we're trying to address. If we bring a view of disability as inherently a deficiency, or an individual characteristic, then we're actually just reproducing and compounding a negative approach to the rights of people of color, and certainly in the context of substance use disorder. But I think we can think, while acknowledging that and not falling into that trap, I think we can think about it in a more forward-looking way. We already know the limitations of a civil rights approach. We know that it tends to be reactive rather than proactive. We know that it's very vulnerable to judicial backlash and weak or inconsistent enforcement. And we also know that it focuses on one characteristic at a time, rather than recognizing the unique harms that occur at the intersection of these characteristics. But of course, these groups aren't separate. right? If 1 in 4 people in the United States are living with some sort of disability, then obviously disability crosses over every boundary and affects every group, of course, not equally. So I think disability rights laws, while acknowledging those limitations, give us some tools to look forward, and we can think creatively, as Courtney suggested, about how to use these legal tools. And what I think is unique about the ADA is that it recognizes that disadvantage is socially constructed, expressly recognizes that in the definition of disability. It also gives us some tools to interrupt and cut through assumptions and stereotypes by requiring individualized, evidence-based assessment, right? If only that was how people with substance use disorder were treated, we'd be a long way down the right road to a better solution. And perhaps what I think is most unique about the ADA is it does not presume that discrimination is an aberration. Jamila Morgan has also made this point. It assumes that discrimination is the norm, that our physical structures, our policies, our practices, our procedures, our institutions, are ableist, they were built that way, and they are required to change, right? That's the broadest view of the reasonable modification or reasonable accommodation type of requirement. So I think it expressly recognizes that these were built in an unjust way and they must be changed. And that's the forward-looking tools that we could think about, one, using them consistently, but also expanding them, and how these ideas and tools and resources could be used more helpfully to address these compounded disadvantages at intersections.
So the other thing I would add that is, I think a particular challenge in this area at the intersection of race and disability in terms of having a substance use disorder is that, and I know this is true for race too, but I'm going to speak just specifically about drug use and having a substance use disorder for a moment, is that just for example, I'll use the healthcare context as an example, right? It is an area where people who work in healthcare, for example, along with the general public, often the norm is that it's completely and totally socially acceptable to openly and overtly discriminate against people on the basis of their use disorder, right? Such that if you could do a search of the literature right now and you would find that there are articles advocating for changing the default in many places, that somebody who uses drugs shouldn't be eligible for a valve transplant or a second valve transplant, simply because they did this to themselves, right? There was a settlement year and a half ago, maybe even 2 years now, I'm forgetting the exact date, where the patient needed a transplant, and a major medical university with perhaps one of the best addiction medicine programs in the country, the transplant program just said, oh no, we don't consider people who have an opioid use disorder who are in treatment for transplants, full stop, even though the person needed a lung transplant, I believe received it here, actually. Thank you. But and on. And I was asked to do a commentary on an article about a year ago where a physician, a primary care physician, had submitted an article suggesting that people who have substance use disorder, opioid use disorder in particular, who are admitted to the hospital, because they don't have the ability to reason themselves, right? And because they're essentially obstructionists and want to leave the hospital, we should have them just enter into an advanced directive for involuntary treatment for the next time they come back. And they should be held to that, even if they have decisional capacity at the time of the second admission. And that was just published. And that was published, and my response was published, which wasn't that kind, really, because there was no examination. All the blame was on the patient. No examination of why do people leave the hospital? Well, because they're surveilled, policed, and treated terribly by healthcare providers almost universally, right? And because it's a perfectly rational act to want to leave the hospital if you also aren't being treated for the horrible withdrawal you're in, right? And I could go on and on. But part of it is just like, it's not just the history. Yes, that's terrible, but the now is pretty terrible. And we need to like think about the norms and the way we think about and examine our assumptions and the things we just say, well, that's normal and those people are bad and they're criminals and, you know, they're not deserving. And I feel like that still needs a lot of attention. And of course, there are promising movements, including some recent settlements, even more recent settlements that didn't make it into our paper because they just happened. But so there is some hope on the horizon, but it's changing, you know, sort of that morass of and mutually reinforcing systems, right, of structural, institutional, and individual discrimination, trying to address it at every angle, at every level. Yeah.
And we're going to talk about the now. We're going to get there in just a second, because that's the most important reason we're here, right? Thalia, let's jump in. What do you think?
Sure. I mean, I think, you know, you asked me the question about the history, and we can all understand the history and articulate the history about social control in schools. But what's missing from that history is there's not a public health law perspective. There's not a public health perspective. There's not a health law perspective. So to the extent, right, and this is what we argue in this piece, and quite frankly, you know, we've been arguing for years, and maybe this is just Derek Bell's interest convergence that we can finally talk about this in a little bit different domain, right, is that we have to confront the racism of school policing and school discipline as a public health imperative and as a public health issue. Education laws are health laws. But how often do you see education laws being discussed as health laws, as either health harming or health affirming, right? When we think about health justice as a framework that really engages us to query, but more importantly, provocatively engage with frontline impacted communities, we're not seeing that intersection of public health professionals standing in solidarity with Black Lives Matters, right? And it's not because they don't want to be, right? I'm not suggesting that. It's a function of they have not been interlocking domains. They have not been seen as the same thing, right? And all part of that same continuum of oppression, of subordination, of exclusion, of policing, and that the racism that exists within a fundamental social determinant of health, right? Education has been outside of that scope. So while the history is important, the history is lacking in that we don't have that intersection, that discourse. And so when I think about moving forward, it's about looking at the fact that in a small paper like this, we can cite what the existing literature is in one figure, right? That tells us here's the traumatic symptomologies of young people who are coming in contact with either exclusionary discipline, punitive discipline, or policing. That here's the way in which this might be compounded. We don't even know because no one's asking that question, right? And then at the end of the day, when we think about even our medical legal partnerships, you know, there are 58 medical legal partnerships that exist in law schools. Half of those medical legal partnerships cite education as an important aspect of the work that they do. But at the end of the day, unfortunately, none of those medical legal partnerships are truly advancing work around discipline and policing, right, in these critical ways that do sit, right, in solidarity with, not to take over, right, the work that's already being done in the community, big C, little c, right, individuals sitting in that most and deeply impacted space. So part of it is to ask ourselves, well, what has been the limits of the civil rights approach? How do we not try to, quote, eclipse the civil rights approach, but to do really what Angela Harris has provoked us to do, is to think about a civil rights of health, right? What is the next phase of this work is really about bringing this work together. And so, you know, I think how we can have that conversation, it's both about looking backwards, of course, but it's more looking forward to say, when we are together, we are stronger, right? And we have that ability to align and to push forward and see this now as the public health imperative, to see that this is impacting not just, and this is where I'm trying to jump back to my notes here, right, where Michelle was talking really specifically about students, and in a particular Breonna Taylor is essential and expendable, but I would say that that's what our students are right now, right? Our young people, they're essential from a social construct, in the ways in which we talk about young people and the ways that we talk about schools is so critical. but many of our students are expendable, right? And their health is expendable. And they move so quickly, or more importantly, are pushed out of schools because of the policies and policing that exist. And then we see them in our emergency rooms. We see them in our juvenile detention facilities. We see them in our adult correction facilities. We see them when they leave confinement and attempt to re-enter society with all of the collateral health consequences and legal consequences that exist. So it's about a continuum, and it's about seeing ourselves coming together in that continuum and really joining in what that work looks like.
I don't remember the name of the scholar or person. I'm bad at kind of remembering that, but there's someone who kind of wrote about this idea that we live in this like post-history time, right? That we essentially at some point stopped wanting to really track, follow, and keep up with history because we kind of like solved the world's problems, whether, you know, technology, through the Industrial Revolution, whatever it was. And so this question is extremely important because we're not done with history. The things and the events that happen that lead up to today are very important. So specifically with involuntary commitment, the way it's understood today is that it's a necessary thing, right? It's kind of this necessary evil. We have people in society, right? The way that the law works is that if you're a danger to yourself or to those around you, a physician, a family member can file an involuntary commitment, and then you'll be held for some amount of time. And if we think about, if we ignore the history of where did this come about? Who started this, right? Laws don't just come out of nowhere. It takes a long, you all know, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not in law, but you know it takes a long time to get a law set and practiced by every single state, and it continues to grow. That's not something that just comes out of nowhere. There's a very methodological and theoretical and historical place that a law like this comes from. So what is that? And so when I started writing this paper to understand more about involuntary commitment, I went to, you know, the beginnings of it and found that it was, you know, repulsed by so many people from the beginning, right? There were physicians and ethicists and lawyers and everyone saying, this is wrong, this is bad. Not only is it unethical, but then after years of doing it, we can then do our, you know, what I do as a public health person, evaluate, you can measure, you can, you know, see how the disparities, all that stuff. And then it's awful. Not only does it, you know, it's not just helping, it actually increases risk of overdose. It increases death, right? It literally kills people. So the question is, where did this law even come from and where did it come about? And it came about as a tool for the state to do social control, right? It's not very hard to tell, right? The story that I tell at the beginning of the paper of Ronald Armstrong, who's a 43-year-old Black man with paranoid schizophrenia, who was killed by the North Carolina police. That interaction just sounds like the same interactions we hear about where police murder and kill Black and brown people, right? So why do we have a law that enables and gives the right and the ability for physicians, public health people, and all of these people to do this? And that's the question that I sought to answer. That's why the history is so important, because to me, why would we have that? You know, why would we have something that's broken, unethical, and is practiced in every state and continues to be practiced? So the question of the history has to point towards, you know, you kind of have to gaze up, look up, instead of just looking at who's being involuntary committed. You have to gaze up and say, why do we have this? Why is this a feature of our society? The second thing I'll say is, this is from the paper, a quote from Kimberly Crenshaw. And she says, the first is to understand, and she's talking about critical race theory. She says, the first is to understand how a regime of white supremacy and its subordination of people of color have been created and maintained in America. And in particular, to examine the relationship between that social structure and professed ideals, such as the rule of law and equal protection. The second is a desire not merely to understand the vexed bond between law and racial power, but to change it. So that's the thing I said earlier, right? It's not just about understanding this relationship, that the involuntary commitment exists. It's killing people, and it's predominantly doing that to Black and brown people, but it's to actually change it. The third thing I'll say is about what I call the, you know, not just I call, the racial health, the racial health disparities complex. That in public health, this is, I mean, if I want to pump out papers and get funds, that's what I'll do, is I'll pick an outcome and I'll pick a couple of exposures, I'll put that in R, I'll run some regressions, and I'll write a paper on it. And I'll tell you, this exposure produces this outcome, and we have a disparity. And I'll just do that for the rest of my career without actually changing it, without interrogating why does that exist, but just merely documenting it. So that's why history again is important. The last thing is, who are you doing this with, right? If I'm just a researcher in my office sitting down and I never interact with anyone who's involuntary committed currently, or if I don't interact with the organizers fighting against involuntary commitment, then I will not be clued in to what's happening. I will be only stuck in the history. I will only be stuck in the disparity. So I have to ask myself, who am I doing this with? Who knows me? Who knows that Rafik is doing research on involuntary commitment in Los Angeles? If the answer is no one, I'm doing this wrong, right? I have to be able to be tied to the community, or else I'm going to be stuck in the history.
And the biggest truth that we have to confront is not just who we're doing it with, but who we're doing it for. And who we're doing it for has two answers, because we're doing it for the communities that are affected, but we're speaking to the people who can make the changes. So in that regard of how we can speak to the people who are affected, but also speak to the people who can make the change, we've got to talk about stigma. We've got to talk about the role that we legalize the word stigma in ways that it has just been mind-blowing. We've created a hysteria around these things, and then we come back and we're like, well, I don't know how we got here. Or we'll say, well, I don't know why these laws exist, or why are we still having the same conversation? So what I want to do, we're going to give this 5 minutes, because if I'm correct, we started at about 1:30 or 10 minutes. All right, we get one person to answer this question, and then I'll go to our hope. All right, I just want our best answer to the role that stigma plays. Y'all looking at me like, what? I'm trying to do the best I can. So I really want to think about the role that stigma plays in this, and how we can use research to confront that in an evidence-based way to really discuss stigma. And if you can keep it short, 2 people can jump in. I just want to stay about 3 minutes if we can on a answer.
I'll just talk about drug use, right? So possession and use are the state sanctioned stigmatization of people who use drugs, including people who have a substance use disorder, full stop. Second, the long history of the separation of all of medicine from the separation of medical care of people with substance use disorder, and they're like separate and separate and certainly more oppressive regulatory systems that communicate one thing, that the people with use disorder are just expendable, not even essential, just expendable, full stop.
Expendability stigma. Let's hear, and then Thalia.
And then actually what I've learned from Kelly is how healthcare for people with substance use disorder is simply not evidence-based. And not only is that permitted to continue, courts are trying to require it. Jails and prisons are trying to require it. Of course, unlawful, but they're still doing it because it's permitted to be treated so separately. And that has to do with that stigma flowing from both disability and race.
So, I mean, I would say that stereotypes and tropes feed into a false narrative, right? They encourage the continued stigmatization of a certain particular set of youth, in particular Black and brown youth, and even more so Black girls, right? When we think about what those stereotypes of the dangerousness of who they are, to your very original example of being thrown across the room, and that includes even being thrown across the room when you're a preschooler. But we have weaponized education laws as health laws, because we say that our exclusionary school discipline laws and our policing laws are to keep our schools healthy and safe, right? So we have weaponized the idea of health. We have taken stigma, right, from all of these tropes and all of these stereotypes and all of the ways in which we want to continuate that white supremacy and perpetuate these systems, and put it under the banner of health and safety.
Do you hold that microphone up? Because I'm coming right back to you. Because you wrote in your paper, you talked about anti-racist equity agendas. Like, what is the approach that gets us to the hope, right? We can talk about all the sad stuff all day, but how do we get out of this mess, right? So can you just talk a little bit about that framework and some of the things that you've seen that as well lays the foundation for us to move forward at the intersections of education and health law and racism?
Well, thinking specifically about education, health law, and racism, it really is about transforming the narrative, but more importantly than catalyzing the action. So we know that if we go to the APHA website, we can immediately see there's more than 200 declarations that racism are a public health crisis. But that when you go and disaggregate that, as of course any good law student would want to do working with me, right? You realize that of those declarations, education is listed in a laundry list of other social determinant systems. So you start to get a little bit narrower, you get a little bit narrow, and you get down to about maybe 10 where education is now listed substantively. And then you break that apart and you have 2 that talk about racism, discrimination, and discipline, and not necessarily all together. And so what does that mean? Where do we go now as we think about this anti-racist health equity agenda that has these prongs, right? That are about improving access to care and quality, improving non-healthcare systems, right? And that's where we focus. It's that naming and condemning the racism, right? This is the wheel that we have on our paper, right? It's about developing participatory, right? And I do focus on that, participatory anti-racist health equity research to help inform then what the next steps are. We have to concretize those declarations, for example. We have to be able to put in the plans. I sit here in a city where there has not been a moratorium on school discipline in the virtual context or in the return to school sort of formal context or policing. That is an immediate and concrete anti-racist health equity step. We will transform the lives of young people who are walking through a door, who are already experiencing high levels of trauma, psychological stress, policing in their community, and not continue to dose affect them by doing the same damn thing, in the context of the school. So we have some really clear and easy low-hanging fruit that we could go for. And then we can start to think about reforming policy, getting to that why and how and where. If we start to infuse subordination to suggest, as Angela Harris has, if we start to infuse the social determinant frameworks, a health justice framework into all the ways in which we understand education law, it's a pretty radical moment. And we have so many new things that we could be doing.
Rafik, I need you to put on your construction hat now. So I want you to lay some foundation. What's next? Where do we go?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I could say what's next in 2 ways. One is like what's happening like around the country. And what's happening is, in New York, I think in San Francisco or in just California as a whole, they're trying to, they're planning to use involuntary commitment as really a way to sweep encampments. So this is happening across the country, right? Where there are encampments, and the answer is to give people housing. That's it. That's how you get rid of encampments, is to give people homes. And instead, right, we've been doing the same thing. We banish people, we push people aside. In Los Angeles, we've created something called Municipal Code 4118 that criminalizes homelessness. So what's happening right now is now involuntary commitment is going to, and conservatorship, right, if you've heard that term, same thing, is being used as a way to sweep people up. So in New York's a little bit more direct, as they're saying, we're going to use involuntary commitment. I think Boston as well, where they go and, they go to someone. And I haven't looked into details of how this is determined, but I already know it's going to be awful. How do you determine that someone's a danger to themselves in an encampment? They're just going to, we know how that's going to work. In California, it's a little bit more tricky. They're at it. There's a lot more fluff. There's a couple of steps, and then they get involuntary committed, and there's a conservatorship. You find it eventually. So when I look at that and I see like, all right, who am I? What am I doing? I'm a second-year PhD student who couldn't get any funding for studying involuntary commitment, and these states, these governors are about to impose them, statewide. That's pretty. I don't know what the word is, but that's daunting. And so is really, just the prison industrial complex as a whole. So as I've grown in my praxis of abolition, one of the things that I've really been drawn to is how this movement understands hope. If you talk to a veteran abolitionist and ask them, like, how many prisons have you taken down? Some of them might say 0. I mean, some of them actually have some. In Los Angeles, we have taken some down. But the idea is that hope is not something like kind of wake up and you open up your Twitter feed and you're like, all right, what's going to give me hope? What's the good news that I can look for? That's not it. At least not in abolition work. It's not how it works. So instead, what the abolitionist and organizer Mary Kaba has said is that hope is a discipline, that this is something that's practiced, right? Think of any discipline you have, being a writer, being an academic, being a scholar. You're not good at that when you start. You work at this, you build it with other people, you fail, you have times where you see success and sometimes when you don't. And you're doing this with very little resources, right? The people who have been resisting this have been, squashed and squelched and killed, right? So we have to recognize we're doing the best with what we can, but part of the hope and the discipline of that hope is to really imagine. And imagination is not a word used in the academy. It's not, at least it's not used in public health very much, but we have to imagine, because the systems that we are imagining and dreaming up of, they probably don't exist right now. When we talk about public health, and I'm all on board with saying like substance use, mental health, these are public health issues. I totally get that. But the public health we have now is not public health. I'm sorry to tell you, we don't have public health in the United States. We have privatized health that's an arm of the carceral state. So it's meant to just control poor people, right? We tell them what to eat. We tell them where they can sleep. That's what public health does. It's used as a way to enforce the social control that the state has. So when I try to dream and imagine, I have to have a completely different way of understanding what am I looking forward to, what am I expecting, and it's really something I practice regularly and daily. So that's where I have hope, is that I'm struggling with the people of Los Angeles and I'm seeing what they're building and doing, and it's not something that gives me hope, but it's hope that I'm building and practicing every day.
I have one job, and that's to turn it over.
That's right. So we have the opportunity for a couple questions. We got to keep them tight. And before we turn it over to questions, thank you all for just such a brilliant, level-setting panel. Really, really so important. We could spend a whole symposium just around this. So Holly, you're going to be telling us about questions like Q&A, and also look here in our audience.
Great. Yes, I will just encourage the folks who are online, if you have a question, to please post it in the Q&A function. I don't have anything yet.
Okay. Any questions from our audience?
All right. This is so our virtual folks can hear us.
Okay. All right.
Hi. Oh, goodness. My goodness. My name is Wendy Bach. I'm from the University of Tennessee. First of all, that was stunning. I'm so excited to talk more to all of you. I wanted to ask, maybe this is a question for Kelly, but it might be for the rest of you, to think about the way the diagnosis in the criminal legal system of substance use disorder is used and misused. So, and what I'm thinking about specifically, is, right, we have a net winding of the criminal legal system in which people are being drawn in by problem-solving courts, but by other courts. And I think that label, right, is being used in a particular way. And I'm just wondering what you've observed, if that makes sense to you.
Thanks. In 30 seconds, I think, right, in any setting, right, a label, it has positive effects and negative effects, right, which we can talk about ad nauseum. I think some of the problem with some of the problem-solving courts, right, is, as Jenna Leva has said, court still in the name, right? Using the court as a mechanism for healthcare, right? Terrible idea. Second terrible thing is that we still have a lot of problem-solving courts where the judges substitute their own judgment based on, moral and punitive narratives rather than, evidence-based medicine, like what would actually be recommended, which is a significant problem, right? And that's a problem in jails and prisons as well. Yeah, and I think I just need to stop there because I have 30 seconds, but I can talk anytime today.
There's actually a settlement 3 days ago where a problem-solving court was requiring that an individual stop medication or change medication with absolutely no medical assessment or expertise.
Well, with that, let's give a broad and round applause to this fabulous panel. Thank you, each of you. And thank you very much to our moderator as well. Kevin, thank you so much for getting us started off in such a brilliant way. Thank you.